Scientists are in shock. The analysis of ancient remains has shown that part of the genetic code of the Scots does not match with either the Celts, the Anglo-Saxons, or even the Vikings. Rare markers have been found in the DNA of the Highlanders that trace their origins back to mysterious tribes that inhabited the islands before the arrival of the first Indo-Europeans. These genetic lines are not found anywhere else in Europe, which means that the ancient mystery is hidden in Scottish blood. Who were these forgotten peoples? Why has their legacy been carefully silenced? Answers to these questions could overturn not only the history of Scotland but of all Europe. Scotland is a land where nature itself seems to have decided to preserve antiquity intact. The mountainous terrain, harsh climatic conditions, and abundance of lakes have, for centuries, formed a barrier that separated the locals from the outside world. Unlike the lowland regions of England, invaders found it harder to penetrate this land, migrations happened less frequently, and contact with the continent remained limited. It is for this reason that the population of the northern and western regions has preserved genetic traits that are almost unseen among their neighbors. Scientists find rare markers in the DNA of Highland residents that indicate a direct lineage from ancient Stone Age tribes. Geography has acted as a natural shield, allowing the Scots to retain their biological and cultural identity, and also explains why their genetic map differs sharply even from their closest neighbors on the British Isles. Traditionally, the Scots are classified as Celts, linked to a Gaelic language and culture that is similar to that of the Irish. However, ancient chronicles and myths mention peoples who lived in this land long before the Celts arrived. The most enigmatic of these were the Picts, who left behind stone steles adorned with symbols whose meanings remain unsolved. Ancient authors describe them as warriors covered in tattoos and unusual patterns. Some legends attribute to the Picts knowledge of secret rituals and customs that distinguished them from neighboring tribes. Archaeology confirms this. Parts of fortifications and settlements in northern Scotland belong to these ancient inhabitants. Oral traditions among the Highlanders preserve tales of peoples that went into the stones and hills, hinting that the Celtic layer is merely a superstructure over a deeper history. This drives scientists to search for the roots of Scottish identity, not only in Celtic heritage but also in pre-Celtic traditions. The Picts hold a special place in the early history of Scotland. They were a people about whom there are few written records, but archaeology and legends portray them as warriors whose bodies were adorned with tattoos and symbolic designs. They built fortified hilltop homes, erected massive round towers, and left behind unique stone steles with mysterious ornaments. The Pictish language disappeared without leaving a direct tradition, which enhances their mystique. However, genetic studies show that they did not vanish without a trace. The DNA of modern inhabitants of northern Scotland, and especially the Highlands, contains markers characteristic of pre-Celtic populations of the British Isles. These lines can be traced back thousands of years and confirm that the Picts formed the foundation of Scotland's ethnogenesis. Their legacy continues to live on in the genes, even if the memory of them fades from the chronicles. This is why many researchers consider the Picts to be key to understanding the uniqueness of the Scottish nation. From the 9th century onwards, the northern seas became gateways for the Norwegian Vikings, who did not limit themselves to raids but actively settled in Scotland. Their influence is especially evident in the Orkney and Shetland Islands, where archaeologists uncover Scandinavian burials, runic inscriptions, and traces of Norwegian settlements. Genetic studies confirm this layer of history. In modern residents of these islands, the proportion of Norwegian genes reaches 20 to 25%, making them some of the most Scandinavianized regions of Britain. The influence of the Vikings manifested not only in DNA but also in culture. Local place names, elements of daily life, and even legal traditions display distinctly Scandinavian traits. However, the Vikings did not erase the local population. They overlapped with the existing Celtic and Pictish layers, creating a complex genetic amalgamation. It is this Norwegian trace that explains why the inhabitants of the Northern Islands are genetically distinct from the majority of Scots. The southern lands of Scotland have historically been a zone of constant contact with England, making them a stage for ethnic mixing. From the early Middle Ages, Anglo-Saxons penetrated here, expanding their territories from the east of Britain. Archaeology records settlements, weapons, and pottery clearly linked to Anglo-Saxon culture, and genetic data confirms the presence of their descendants in the southern regions. Additionally, there is a more ancient layer of Britons, descendants from the Roman era, who left behind both cultural and biological legacies. Consequently, the genetic map of the South is closer to that of England than to northern Scotland. But the surprising fact is this: the core population of the northern mountainous areas was hardly affected by these waves. There, the genetics retained ancient markers inherited from the Picts and early Celts, which makes Highland residents genetically more ancient than those in the border territories. Thus, the South became an arena for assimilation, while the North became a stronghold of preserved uniqueness. Most modern Scots belong to the R1b haplogroup through their male line, one of the most common in Western Europe. This haplogroup is associated with Celtic tribes whose influence stretches from the Atlantic to the Alps. However, unique sub-branches of this line have been identified among the Scots that are not found in neighbors in England or Ireland. Geneticists link these to waves of migration during the Bronze Age, when carriers of the corded ware culture arrived on the islands. These sub-branches have been preserved due to the isolation of the mountainous regions, where family lines have been passed down almost uncontaminated for generations. Research from the Scotland's DNA Project has shown that certain Scottish clans, such as the MacDonalds or the Frasers, can trace their lineage back to specific branches of R1b that date back thousands of years. This makes the DNA of the Scots not just part of the Celtic world, but a distinct direction within it, where rare and ancient mutations have been preserved. Although the male lines of the Scots are predominantly Celtic R1b, the genetic portrait of the northeastern regions also includes other equally interesting markers. A significant portion of the population has haplogroups I1 and I2. The former is associated with Scandinavians and is typical for descendants of Vikings, while the latter traces back to much earlier times, specifically to pre-Indo-European hunter-gatherers who inhabited Europe as far back as the Stone Age. Their presence in the DNA of the Scots indicates that the islands were not completely isolated. Migration waves from different eras reached here. The Scandinavian trace is explained by the Vikings and their settlements, while the I2 line suggests that parts of the pre-Indo-European population managed to survive and integrate into subsequent ethnic layers. This unique combination confirms that the genetic landscape of Scotland is much deeper and older than is commonly assumed, and it is precisely this that distinguishes the Scots from most of their European neighbors. The Orkney Islands are a true open-air museum, where the stone monuments of the Stone Age are better preserved than in any other part of Britain. Here stands the Skara Brae complex, an ancient village over 5,000 years old, as well as the Ring of Brodgar and other stone circles reminiscent of Stonehenge. These structures indicate a highly developed Neolithic society with knowledge in astronomy and engineering. Recent studies of the DNA of remains found in Neolithic burial mounds in the Orkney Islands have revealed unexpected connections. Some genetic lines trace back to the population of the Iberian Peninsula. This means that some of the first farmers arrived here by sea from the region of modern Spain and Portugal, bringing with them new technologies and traditions. Their descendants became an important component of the future gene pool of Scotland. The archaeology of Orkney not only opens pages of the past, it shows that the genetic history of the Scots began with cultural intersections thousands of years earlier than previously thought. Around 2500 BC, the carriers of the corded ware culture infiltrated Scotland, a wave that spread across almost all of Europe. These tribes were not simply migrants, they brought with them a completely new way of life. Instead of the traditions of Neolithic farmers, there appeared burial mounds, battle axes, and characteristic decorated pottery. But the most significant legacy of these migrations is the genes. It was at this time that the R1b haplogroup entered Scotland, which later became dominant among the Celts, and still determines the genetic makeup of much of the population. Studies of ancient DNA show that these settlers gradually displaced or assimilated previous inhabitants, leaving only traces in specific lines. The Bronze Age migration was a turning point. It marks the beginning of the formation of the genetic foundation upon which Scottish history is built. Without this wave, it is impossible to understand where their unique combination of ancient and new markers comes from. One of the most unexpected discoveries of recent years has been the similarity of the DNA of the Scots with that of the inhabitants of northern Spain, particularly those from the Basque country. Geneticists have found that some lines in the Scottish gene pool are closer to Basque ones than to English or even Irish lines. This has been a shock, as it was traditionally believed that the genetic map of Britain was shaped primarily by the Celts, Anglo-Saxons, and Vikings. However, the connection to the Iberian Peninsula goes back millennia, to those very Neolithic and Bronze Age migrations when maritime routes connected the Atlantic coasts of Europe into a unified network. Farmers and seafarers from Iberia brought new technologies and culture to the north, leaving their genetic mark behind. This fact explains why the genetic isolation of the Scots has made them closer to the distant Basques than to their nearest neighbors across the border. For science, this has provided evidence that the story of Scotland's ethnogenesis is far broader and older than previously thought. Scottish clans not only shaped the political and military structure of the mountainous regions, but also had a tremendous influence on the preservation of genetic heritage. The insular nature of the clan system, in which marriages often occurred within the same clan or with close allies, allowed for rare lines of DNA to be retained over centuries. Research from the Scotland's DNA Project has shown that members of the MacDonald clan predominantly carry sub-branches of the R1b haplogroup, linking them to Bronze Age migrations. The Campbell clan showcases lines with a more distinctly Celtic character, while the Frasers exhibit even Scandinavian markers reflecting the Viking era's contacts. This variety demonstrates that behind the apparent cultural unity lay different roots. Each clan has become a living archive of migrations and mixtures, preserving ancient layers of history in their blood. Therefore, the clan structure not only strengthened social ties but also became an involuntary custodian of Scotland's genetic memory. In the 11th century, Britain underwent a significant political and cultural upheaval, the Norman Conquest. William the Conqueror's army brought not only new laws, architecture, and feudal systems, but also a new genetic layer. In Scotland, the influence of the Normans mainly manifested in the lowland areas and the southeast of the country, where their descendants settled. Archaeological finds and written sources testify to the relocation of Norman nobility, who quickly integrated into local elites by marrying into Scottish clans. Genetic analysis indicates that their traces are not as widespread as those of the Celts or Vikings, but they are noticeable in the DNA of lowland inhabitants. These lines are associated with Western European branches of the R1b haplogroup, closely resembling Norman and French samples. At the same time, the Normans did not significantly affect the mountainous regions, where the traditional clan structure preserved ancient genetics. Thus, their influence was localized, yet it added another European nuance to the mosaic of Scottish origins. One of the key factors in shaping Scottish identity was the migration of Gaelic tribes from Ireland in the early Middle Ages. By the 5th to 6th centuries, the Scots tribe, having settled in western Scotland, effectively gave the country its name, Scotland. These migrants brought with them not only language and culture, but also new genetic lines. Modern studies show that many Scots, especially in the west of the country and Argyll, display haplotypes closely related to Irish ones. Even surnames like O'Neill or McCarthy, which have taken hold in Scottish society, testify to ancient Irish roots. Genetically, this means that R1b was enriched with specific Irish sub-branches, which intertwined with the existing lines of the Highlanders. As a result, Western Scotland became a zone of intersection for two Celtic streams, local and Irish, intensifying the ethnic and cultural proximity of the two nations. The Irish line in the DNA of the Scots is not simply a legacy. It is tangible evidence of a shared fate on both sides of the Irish Sea. For centuries, a stereotype has persisted, that Scots and English are almost one people, divided only by political borders. However, genetic studies of recent decades have shown the opposite. Analyses of thousands of DNA samples have revealed a striking contrast. The English population is primarily connected to the Anglo-Saxons and more recent migrations from the continent, while the Scots prominently exhibit more ancient layers tracing back to the Bronze Age and even earlier. A particularly sharp break is observed between the Northern Highlanders and the residents of southern England. While the English are genetically closer to the Dutch and Germans, the Scots show a unique cocktail of lineages, from ancient Picts and Celts to traces of Iberian migrants. These differences are so evident that modern geneticists refer to Scotland as a genetic island within an island. Thus, DNA shatters the old myth of British homogeneity and confirms that Scottish identity has a distinct, deeply independent foundation. Modern genetic research has revealed a remarkable fact. Rare haplotypes persist in the Scottish Highlands that are found nowhere else in Europe. These lines seem to have frozen in time, reflecting the legacy of the region's earliest inhabitants. Unlike the more mixed populations of the lowlands, where migrations and assimilations transpired for centuries, isolation and the clan's seclusion acted as a natural filter for the Highlanders. This preservation of unique markers in Y chromosomes and mitochondrial DNA enables a direct connection to tribes that inhabited the northern lands as far back as the Stone and Bronze Ages. For science, such finds provide a rare opportunity to reconstruct ethnogenesis, as they offer access to genetic lines that have long vanished from other parts of Europe. Moreover, it is these markers that demonstrate how distinctive the Scottish gene pool remains despite all waves of conquerors and migrations. This is compelling evidence that Scotland harbors a unique code in its blood that has survived for millennia. In addition to the obvious Celtic and Norwegian roots, scientists have discovered an intriguing detail in the genomes of the Scots: traces of Eastern genes. A small portion of the population, primarily in the north, exhibits a tiny percentage of DNA linked to Siberian and Finno-Ugric peoples. This fact came as a genuine revelation. Seemingly, remote Scotland had no direct contacts with the Eurasian steppes. However, archaeogenetics indicates that even in the Bronze Age and early Iron Age, migration waves from Eastern Europe reached the very edges of the Atlantic. Nomads and carriers of steppe cultures not only moved westward, but also gradually left their genetic imprint interwoven into local lineages. Today, this Asian tint manifests only in fractions of a percent, but its significance is enormous. It proves that even the most remote corners of Europe were connected to a wide network of ancient movements. For Scotland, this means that its DNA preserves memory not just of Celts and Vikings, but also of long-forgotten Eastern pathways. The political history of Britain has long been built on the idea of unity. London has sought to present the island as a monolithic state where differences between peoples seemingly dissolve under a common crown. However, modern genetic research is significantly cracking this myth. The DNA of the Scots demonstrates such distinct differences from the English sample that scholars increasingly refer to them as a self-contained ethnogenetic world. For politicians, this is an inconvenient truth. Rather than portraying a unified nation, science reveals a picture where Scotland has its own roots extending deep into millennia, largely diverging from its island neighbors. This data lends new weight to ideas of national identity that are already strong in society. It turns out that the question of independence is not just about politics and economics, but also biology. The unique genetic map renders the argument of blood unity untenable. Genetics, seemingly distant from politics, has unwittingly become a powerful tool of it. In the 21st century, science has taken a decisive step toward understanding the true origins of the Scots. Projects such as Scotland's DNA and major European genomic initiatives have finally enabled the tracing of ancestral lines on a national scale, rather than through isolated findings. The results have been staggering. The Scots are not just Celts, but a product of a complex ethnogenetic amalgamation. Their genomes combine the oldest lines of Stone Age hunters and gatherers, Iberian markers brought by maritime migrants, Celtic sub-branches of R1b, Scandinavian traces of Vikings, and even rare Asian admixtures. This genetic cocktail has no exact analogues in Europe. Interestingly, the northern and western regions of the country have preserved a purer imprint of ancient layers, whereas the South has become more mixed due to Anglo-Saxon and Norman influences. Contemporary research does not only document these variations, It establishes a new notion of Scotland as a nation with a deeply unique genetic history. Today, in an era of genome sequencing and global studies, the Scots can confidently assert their blood carries an entire encyclopedia of Europe. It includes echoes of the Picts, warriors whose symbols remain unsolved, traces of the Celts with their language and mythology, Norwegian genes of the Vikings who brought their maritime traditions, and even shadows of forgotten tribes that came from the south and east millennia ago. This blend transforms Scotland into more than just a country on the map. It becomes a living museum of ethnogenesis. For the modern Scot, knowledge of these facts is not abstract science, but a source of pride and understanding of their uniqueness. In a world where national identity is increasingly questioned, DNA stands as proof that Scotland has always been a separate civilization and not merely a regional offshoot of Britain. This realization strengthens the spirit of the people and confirms that the history of Scotland is a tale of uniqueness that has endured against time and politics.